My name is Eleanor, and I'm 58 years old. I spent my entire life as a school principal, the kind of woman who believed that patience, fairness, and calm could fix almost anything. But that night, in my own dining room, I learned that some storms don't calm when met with silence, they demand strength. My daughter, Lila, had always been my pride. She was bright, beautiful, and determined everything I ever hoped she'd become. When she married Nathan 3 years ago, I wanted to believe he was the perfect match for her. He was charming in that polished corporate way, sharp suits, smooth words, the kind of man who could light up a room when he wanted to. But behind that charm, I sensed something else, something dark that Lila either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. That Sunday evening was supposed to be peaceful. I'd invited them over to celebrate Lila's promotion at work. It had been months since I'd seen her, and though we spoke often over the phone, I could tell something had changed in her voice lately. There was a quiet hesitation in her laughter, a pause before she spoke Nathan's name. I told myself not to assume the worst. After all, not every marriage is perfect. I spent the afternoon cooking her favorite dishes, roast chicken with lemon and thyme, buttered green beans, and my homemade apple pie. I set the table carefully, polished the glasses, and even placed the old family photo in the corner cabinet. I wanted it to feel like home, like safety. When the doorbell rang, I smiled automatically. Lila walked in first, looking lovely but tired. There were faint shadows under her eyes, the kind that come from restless nights. Nathan followed behind her, his movements slightly unsteady. The smell of whiskey lingered faintly on him, though he tried to hide it with a mint. "Eleanor, good to see you," he said, smiling too wide. His eyes didn't match the curve of his mouth. "Good to see you too, Nathan," I replied, my tone polite but guarded. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Lila complimented the food, and we shared light talk about her job. But Nathan's mood shifted quickly. He interrupted her often, correcting small details in her stories, laughing at moments that weren't funny. He made a comment about my old-fashioned decor and asked if I ever got bored living alone. I kept my composure. "Solitude isn't loneliness," I said, keeping my voice even. "It can be peaceful." He chuckled. A low sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Peaceful, sure. But a bit empty, don't you think?" Lila shot him a warning look, but he ignored it. Something inside me stirred a quiet unease, the kind that tells you danger isn't loud. It whispers. As the evening wore on, Nathan poured himself another glass of wine. Then another. His words grew heavier, laced with arrogance. He began criticizing the smallest things, the salt in the potatoes, the temperature of the room, the way I looked at him. Finally, I said, "Nathan, maybe that's enough wine for tonight." He looked up sharply, his smile gone. "I think I can handle myself, Eleanor." Lila's voice trembled. "Nathan, please." He slammed his glass down, and before anyone could react, his hand jerked, sending it flying across the table. The glass exploded against the edge of the wooden surface. I felt a sharp sting across my wrist as shards scattered like tiny daggers. The room fell silent, the echo of breaking glass ringing in my ears. Lila gasped and ran toward me. "Mom! You're bleeding!" She grabbed a napkin, pressing it against the cut, her hands shaking. Nathan froze for a second, then muttered, "It was an accident. You startled me." His tone was flat, unconvincing. He didn't look sorry. He looked annoyed that anyone was reacting at all. I met his eyes. There was a glint there, a flicker of satisfaction he couldn't quite hide. He wanted me to react, to shout, to make a scene. But I didn't. Instead, I stood slowly, clutching the napkin against my wrist. "It's all right," I said softly, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "Accidents happen." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lila looked between us, tears forming. Nathan's smirk returned, faint but present. He thought he'd won something in that moment, that his control extended beyond my daughter and into my home. I excused myself quietly and went to the bathroom to rinse the wound. The cut wasn't deep, but the sight of the blood made something inside me shift. As I stared at my reflection in the mirror, The pain wasn't what burned, it was the humiliation. I'd spent my life teaching young people about composure, about grace under pressure. And now, here I was, standing alone in my own home, with a man who'd just shown me his true nature. I wrapped my wrist carefully and returned to the dining room. The tension was suffocating. Lila tried to apologize through her tears, whispering that she'd talked to him, that he didn't mean it. Nathan avoided my gaze, pretending to check his phone. When they finally left, Lila hugged me tight. "I'm so sorry, Mom. He just gets stressed sometimes." I stroked her hair gently. "Go home, darling. We'll talk soon." She nodded, still trembling, and walked out the door beside him. I watched their car disappear into the night. The house felt heavier when the silence returned. I sat at the table, staring at the broken glass still glinting under the light. I didn't feel fear anymore, just a cold, deliberate calm. That wasn't an accident. I knew it the moment I saw his eyes. And he thought I'd let it go. He had no idea what kind of woman he had just underestimated. The glass had sliced my wrist. But it wasn't the pain that burned, it was his smirk. The silence that followed that dinner was unlike any silence I'd ever known. It wasn't peaceful, it was hollow, tense, alive with everything that hadn't been said. The next morning, I woke with the faint sting on my wrist, reminding me that what happened wasn't a nightmare. It was real. Lila called me early, her voice soft and shaky. "Mom, I'm so sorry about last night. Nathan feels awful. He said it was an accident." I wanted to believe her. But the image of his smirk, the glint in his eye right after the glass shattered, played over and over in my mind. I'd spent years reading people, students, teachers, even troubled parents. There was no accident in that movement. It was controlled, purposeful. Still, I didn't want to scare Lila. "It's all right, darling," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm fine. Just a small cut." "Are you sure?" she asked. "He didn't mean—" "I know what he didn't mean," I interrupted gently. "Take care of yourself, Lila. I'll see you soon." When I hung up, I stood by the kitchen window, watching the morning light stretch across the lawn. The quiet of my home, usually comforting, now felt like a weight pressing against my chest. I thought about calling Nathan, demanding an apology, maybe even confronting him in person. But something stopped me. I realized that giving him my anger would be giving him exactly what he wanted. He would twist it, manipulate it, turn it against me and worse, against my daughter. I needed to be patient. I needed to be smarter than him. I spent the day cleaning up the remnants of the dinner. The shards of glass sparkled like tiny reminders of his temper. I swept every corner carefully, as though removing not just the mess, but the energy he'd left behind. The scent of the spilled wine clung stubbornly to the air, a bitter aftertaste of humiliation. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea. I tried to read, but my mind kept drifting back to the look on Lila's face, fear wrapped in confusion. It wasn't the look of a woman defending her husband's mistake. It was the look of someone used to walking on eggshells. I'd seen that expression before in women who'd come to my school years ago seeking help for their children, their bruises hidden beneath sleeves. I'd seen it in mothers who smiled too brightly, who apologized for everything. It chilled me to realize that my own daughter now wore that same expression. As night settled, I walked into the bathroom and unwrapped the bandage from my wrist. The cut had scabbed over, but the mark was red and raw. I touched it lightly and felt a jolt of anger, not at the pain, but at the memory of his smirk. That quiet satisfaction he'd felt seeing me bleed. I looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection didn't look weak. My eyes were calm, steady, calculating. That's when I made a promise to myself, and to every woman I'd ever known who'd stayed silent when they should have fought back. Nathan would never raise his hand or his voice against me again. But this wasn't about a single night or a broken glass anymore. It was about my daughter. She was trapped, whether she knew it or not, and if I handled this wrong, I could lose her too. Abusers isolate their victims, twisting their minds until they doubt their own reality. If I attacked Nathan head-on, he'd turn her against me. No, this needed precision, patience, strategy. For the next few days, I didn't reach out. I let things settle, giving him time to believe I'd moved on. When Lila texted photos of her garden or her new office, I replied warmly, never mentioning that night. I wanted her to feel safe with me, not judged. But when I was alone, I replayed everything in my mind, the tone of his voice, the timing of his anger, the control he had over her. Every piece was a clue. Every detail told me what kind of man I was dealing with. One afternoon, as I was watering my plants, I thought about the countless women I'd counseled through the school system. Many had said the same thing Lila did. He didn't mean it. They always said it after the first time, never realizing there would be a second, then a third. I refused to let that become Lila's story. That night, I wrote everything down in a notebook, the date, what he said, how he looked, every detail I could remember. It felt strange, documenting something so personal, but I knew I might need it later. My instincts told me this wasn't over. Days turned into a week, and I received another call from Lila. Nathan wants to apologize, she said hesitantly. He feels terrible about everything. I almost laughed at the word apologize. If he's sorry, that's good, I replied evenly. But I think it's best we give each other space for a while. She sounded disappointed, maybe even conflicted. Okay, Mom, I understand. When we hung up, I sat there, my hand resting on that same wrist where the scar still burned faintly. That wasn't just a wound, it was a message. A message that said I'd been marked by his cruelty once. And only once. Because the next time Nathan tried to cross a line, I would be ready. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew this. Men like him thrived on underestimation. He believed I was fragile, too old to be a threat, too polite to fight back. That was his first mistake, and it would be his last. But as the door closed that night, I promised myself, Nathan would regret ever lifting his hand or his arrogance against me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flash of broken glass, heard the sound of it scattering across the table, and felt again the sting that wasn't just on my wrist, it was in my heart. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying every word, every look, every smirk Nathan had ever given me since the day Lila introduced him. I had ignored so many little things, dismissing them as personality quirks or generational differences. Now I realized they weren't quirks, they were warnings. When dawn came, I sat by the window with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. The world outside looked peaceful, birds chirping, a light breeze brushing the curtains, but inside, I was unraveling threads of memories I had buried years ago. You see, before I retired, I ran a community outreach program alongside my work at the school. We helped women, mostly mothers of students, escape abusive relationships. I'd spent years watching the same pattern repeat. The charm, the control, the excuses, the isolation. It always started small, an insult disguised as a joke, a temper brushed off as stress, an accident that wasn't one. And every woman who walked through my door said the same thing. He didn't mean it. Now my own daughter was saying those words. I remembered a woman named Faith who once came to me with bruises hidden under her cardigan. She smiled through tears and told me she'd tripped down the stairs. 2 weeks later, she came back with her arm in a sling. She finally left her husband, but only after he broke her ribs. I'd helped her rebuild her life, find work, find strength, but I never forgot the way she looked when she said, "I thought I could change him." That memory haunted me now. Lila thought she could change Nathan too. As I stared into my coffee, I realized that my daughter was walking down the same path so many women had taken before her, and I couldn't let her reach the same end. I began piecing together every moment I'd shared with Nathan. The way he'd always dominated conversations. The subtle jabs at Lila's choices, the clothes she wore, the friends she kept. Even the tone of her laugh. The last time we'd had dinner at their house, I'd noticed how quickly she'd jumped up to refill his drink, how she flinched when he raised his voice at the television. At the time, I'd told myself I was imagining things. That's what mothers do, we give the benefit of the doubt because we want our children to be happy. But now, every memory had a different color. The warning signs were clear as daylight. I knew I couldn't just confront Nathan. That would drive him further into control, make him paint me as the meddling mother. I had to be quiet, observant, strategic. My years as a principal had taught me that the best way to deal with bullies was to let them expose themselves. That morning, I called an old friend, Janine, a lawyer who'd once volunteered with me at the outreach center. I hadn't spoken to her in months, but when she picked up, her familiar warmth steadied me. "Eleanor," she said, "you sound troubled. What's going on?" I told her everything, every detail of that dinner, the glass, the look in Nathan's eyes, and the way Lila kept defending him. She listened quietly, no interruptions, no judgment. When I finished, she sighed. "It's textbook," she said softly. "He's testing boundaries." "That wasn't an accident, Eleanor. That was control disguised as carelessness." "I know," I whispered. "But I can't just accuse him. Lila will defend him. She's too deep." "Then don't accuse him," Janine said. "Collect proof. Be smart about it. These men trip on their own pride eventually. You just need to be ready when he does." Those words stuck with me long after I hung up. Proof. That's what I needed. Something undeniable. Something that couldn't be twisted or dismissed. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention. Every phone call from Lila, every text, every hesitation in her voice. I started to see the pattern. He monitored her time, questioned her whereabouts, criticized her friends. I didn't need to be in their home to know what was happening. I could hear it in her silence. One afternoon, she came by unexpectedly. She looked thinner, paler. She smiled when she saw me, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "How's work?" I asked gently. "It's fine," she said, her gaze flickering to the floor. "Nathan's been a little stressed, that's all. Work pressure." "Work pressure doesn't cut people," I replied quietly. She froze, her fingers tightening around her purse strap. "Mom, please, he didn't mean it. You know how men get sometimes." No, I thought. I knew exactly how men like Nathan got. I didn't push her further. I knew that if I did, she'd retreat. Instead, I hugged her and said, "I just want you safe, sweetheart. That's all." After she left, I sat alone, my heart heavy but my mind focused. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the night of the shattered glass, but I could make sure there wouldn't be another. I went into my study and took out a small black notebook. On the first page, I wrote, "Nathan Clark, October 14th. Then I started jotting down every detail I could remember about his behavior. His tone, his expressions, his drinking, his control. Each note was a brick in the foundation of what I was building, a case of truth. I looked down at the scar on my wrist, tracing it lightly with my fingertip. It wasn't just a wound, it was a reminder. A reminder that I had been blind once, but not anymore. And as I closed the notebook and locked it away in my drawer, I knew this was just the beginning. The old me, the patient, polite Eleanor, had stayed behind at that dinner table. The woman who rose from it now was someone Nathan would never see coming. By the end of that call, I had a plan that would quietly turn Nathan's arrogance against him. For the next 2 weeks, I became invisible but observant. It's strange how silence can make people reveal who they truly are. When you stop reacting, when you listen instead of speak, the truth slips out like smoke under a closed door. That was my approach now. I had no intention of confronting Nathan directly. I would let him believe he'd frightened me into submission, that I was the harmless, aging mother-in-law too timid to stand up to him. Let him underestimate me. It was the one weapon he'd never see coming. Lila came by for tea the following Sunday. I had baked her favorite scones, trying to keep things as ordinary as possible. She sat at the kitchen table, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. I studied her face, the faint bruise under her right eye, barely covered with concealer. She noticed my gaze and quickly turned away. "Car door," she said, too quickly, forcing a smile. I nodded but said nothing. If I showed anger or disbelief, she'd retreat behind excuses. Instead, I kept my voice soft. "Busy week?" "Very," she murmured. "Nathan's been stressed. His company's restructuring. It's been a lot." I reached across the table and touched her hand. "Just make sure you take care of yourself too, Lila." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. I could feel her fear, her confusion. I wanted to grab her and beg her to leave him, but I knew how fragile that balance was. I'd seen it too many times before pushed too hard, and the victim runs straight back to their abuser, convinced only he understands them. No, I had to play this carefully. After she left, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, staring at the empty teacup she'd left behind. I could still smell her perfume, delicate and familiar. And beneath it, faint traces of something else: sadness, exhaustion, and silence. That silence spoke louder than any words could. That evening, I found myself staring at the small voice recorder Janine had given me years ago, back when we worked with survivors. It was discreet, shaped like a USB drive. I'd kept it tucked away in a drawer, never imagining I'd need it again. Now, I held it in my hand like a key to a locked truth. The next time Nathan and Lila came to visit just for coffee, casual as always, I placed the recorder under a folded napkin on the counter before they arrived. They showed up late, as expected. Nathan was loud and boisterous, his laugh too sharp, his energy invasive. He made a show of bringing flowers, as though to display his charm. "For the best mother-in-law in the world," he said with that smooth, practiced smile. "Thank you, Nathan," I replied evenly, keeping my tone neutral. "It's thoughtful of you." He poured himself coffee and started criticizing my furniture again. Small comments at first, the kind meant to seem harmless. But I could hear the undertone, the way his voice lowered when Lila spoke, how he subtly corrected her, how he made her sound foolish when she wasn't. Every minute of it went into that recorder. After they left, I sat at the table, listening through earbuds to the playback. His tone was there, the mockery, the control, the quiet threats disguised as jokes. I knew what I was hearing because I'd heard it so many times in others' stories. The seed of abuse always begins with the illusion of love. I labeled the recording and stored it on my computer, backing it up twice. I wasn't just collecting evidence anymore, I was preparing for a war Nathan didn't even know had started. Over the next week, I began noticing things in the community too. A friend of mine from the local cafe mentioned seeing Nathan arguing loudly on his phone one morning. Another, who worked near his office, told me he'd heard rumors about Nathan's temper at work, how he'd once thrown a stapler during a meeting. Each piece of gossip confirmed what I already knew. The man had cracks beneath his polished exterior, and those cracks were widening. I wrote everything down. Dates, times, witnesses, recordings. My notebook was no longer just notes, it was a roadmap to his undoing. Yet, even as I gathered evidence, I never let my mask slip. When Lila called, I kept my tone gentle and supportive. I didn't mention the recording. Didn't hint at my plan. I simply reminded her that she always had a place to come home to. I also began quietly reconnecting with old allies. People from my years at the outreach center. Janine introduced me to a detective she trusted. Someone who specialized in domestic abuse cases. I didn't file a report yet, I wasn't ready for that, but I asked questions. I learned about the kind of proof the courts took seriously, the kind that couldn't be twisted or dismissed as exaggeration. I was meticulous. Every move had to count. Every piece of evidence had to be irrefutable. By the end of the second week, I had hours of recordings, several documented incidents, and enough behavioral patterns noted to expose the truth. But I knew evidence alone wasn't enough. People like Nathan were performers. They needed an audience to see the show collapse. And so, I began planning a setting where the mask would finally fall, a moment where Nathan's charm would betray him in front of witnesses. I didn't want to fight. I wanted revelation. I wanted him to destroy himself with his own arrogance. As I stood by the window that night, looking out at the fading light, I felt a quiet sense of certainty settle over me. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had burned away, replaced by clarity. This wasn't vengeance, it was protection. This was me doing what I had always done, teaching someone a lesson they'd never forget. Nathan thought he was playing a game of dominance. He didn't realize I'd rewritten the rules. And when the time came, he'd be the one exposed, stripped of control, undone by his own temper. I knew the next time we met, I'd make him show his true colors in front of everyone. When I suggested another dinner, Nathan's smile didn't reach his eyes. That told me everything I needed to know. He thought I was giving him another chance to prove his charm, to re-establish control. But what I was really doing was setting the stage, a stage he would walk onto willingly, blind to the trap that waited beneath his feet. I called Lila a week before and told her I wanted to host a small family dinner, just to reconnect, to move past the awkwardness of our last gathering. I made sure my tone sounded light, forgiving. She hesitated at first, then agreed. Relief in her voice. "That sounds nice, Mom," she said softly. "Nathan will be happy to hear that." I doubted that. Nathan's happiness was conditional, it existed only when he felt superior. But that was fine. That arrogance would be his undoing. I decided the dinner would take place on a Friday evening, when everyone would be relaxed and unsuspecting. I invited a few close friends, people Nathan didn't know well, and my brother, Frank, a retired police officer with a calm presence and a sharp eye. I didn't tell him everything, just enough for him to understand that his presence was a precaution. Frank trusted my instincts, he always had. For days I planned every detail with precision. The food, the lighting, the seating arrangement, everything mattered. I wanted Nathan to feel comfortable, to believe that I had moved on. I needed him confident, smug, certain of his control. Because people like Nathan only reveal their true selves when they think no one is watching, or worse, when they think they've already won. On the night of the dinner, I stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of sauce, my reflection flickering in the polished steel of the stovetop. My heart was steady, I wasn't nervous, just focused. Years of being a principal had trained me for moments like this, containing chaos behind a calm smile. When the doorbell rang, I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door. Nathan stood there with that same smooth grin, a bottle of expensive wine in one hand and his other arm looped around Lila's shoulders. "Eleanor," he said warmly. "We're honored to be invited back after the little misunderstanding." Misunderstanding? That word almost made me laugh. I kept my expression neutral. "Water under the bridge," I replied. "Come in." Lila kissed my cheek. She looked more at ease than the last time I'd seen her, but I could still sense the tension beneath her smile. She wanted peace, harmony, normalcy, things Nathan would never allow her to have. As the other guests arrived, the house filled with chatter and the clinking of glasses. My brother greeted Nathan with a firm handshake, his eyes quietly assessing. Nathan, ever the performer, turned on his charm, complimenting my cooking, flattering my guests, making jokes that made people laugh out of politeness rather than humor. I moved through the room effortlessly, serving food, pouring drinks, smiling when required. But my mind was working, timing every beat, every word. The voice recorder was hidden again, this time under the sideboard near the table. It was ready, though it might not even be necessary. I suspected Nathan would give me all the evidence I needed tonight, live, unfiltered, and in front of witnesses. When dinner was served, I deliberately placed Nathan beside my brother and across from me. Lila sat beside me, between us a fragile peacekeeper caught between fire and steel. The evening began pleasantly enough. Stories were exchanged, laughter flowed, and Nathan seemed at ease. But as the wine bottle emptied, his tone began to shift. It was subtle at first, a sarcastic jab about my old-school values. A snide remark about people who don't understand modern relationships. I could feel my guests growing uncomfortable. Lila gave him warning glances, her smile tightening. Frank watched quietly, his jaw set. I leaned forward, smiling pleasantly. "Nathan, why don't you tell everyone about that promotion you were supposed to get? How's work been treating you?" He smirked. Well, you know how it is in business. You do everything right, but people don't appreciate real leadership anymore. Everyone's too sensitive these days." "Sensitive?" I asked lightly. "You mean people who expect respect?" The room went quiet. Nathan chuckled, mistaking my calm for submission. "Respect is earned, Eleanor. Some people just can't handle criticism." His words hung in the air, dripping with irony. I could feel every eye at the table on us. He was taking the bait perfectly. I raised my glass, my voice steady. "To family," I said softly. "To love. And to truth." Nathan lifted his glass, smug and unaware. To truth, he echoed, with a smirk that made my blood run cold. That was the moment I had planned for. My brother gave me the slightest nod across the table, an unspoken signal that everything was under control. I reached for my phone and smiled. Actually, speaking of truth, I wanted to share something funny from last time you were here, I said. I accidentally recorded a bit of our dinner conversation. Would you believe my phone was sitting on the table the whole time? Nathan laughed, leaning back in his chair. Oh? Did I say something scandalous? You could say that, I replied, tapping the screen. And then it began. His voice filled the room, mocking, belittling, cruel. The recording captured his tone perfectly, the venom behind the charm, the way he spoke down to Lila, the way he sneered at me. Every word hung heavy in the air. The laughter at the table died instantly. The room went cold. Lila's fork slipped from her hand. Nathan, she whispered, her face pale. That's you, he stammered, his confidence faltering. That's out of context. Frank set down his glass, his eyes sharp. Sounded pretty clear to me. Nathan's mask cracked. I saw the flash of rage behind his composure, the predator realizing he'd been cornered. He lunged forward suddenly, reaching across the table. Give me that phone, he shouted. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply looked him in the eye and said calmly, don't. And just as his hand froze midair, Frank reached into his jacket and revealed his badge. The soft glint of authority under the warm light of the dining room. The silence that followed was absolute. Nathan's face turned pale, his confidence evaporating before my eyes. When I raised my glass for a toast, the trap was finally set in motion. I started with a smile, but every word was laced with intention. The calmness in my tone wasn't kindness, it was control. To family, to love, and to truth, I said, raising my glass. Around the table, people murmured in agreement, glasses clinking. Nathan smirked, self-satisfied, certain that I had finally forgiven him. He had no idea what was coming. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of arrogance. Ah, truth, he said, his lips curling. A rare thing these days. Indeed, I replied, tapping a few buttons on my phone. In fact, it's so rare I thought I'd bring a little of it to the table tonight. Lila frowned slightly. Mom, what do you mean? Just something I came across, I said lightly. A little soundbite from our last dinner together. I pressed play. The room fell silent. Nathan's voice filled the air, sharp, venomous, mocking. The recording was crystal clear. She's always meddling. His voice spat from the phone's speaker. That woman needs to learn her place. Lila, if your mother talks to me like that again, I swear I stopped the recording there. I didn't need to play the rest. The words alone hung heavy, poisoning the air. For a long moment, no one moved. The clinking of cutlery stopped. The laughter that had once filled the room evaporated. All that remained was the hum of the ceiling fan and the sharp sound of Lila's breath catching in her throat. Nathan's expression changed instantly from superiority to panic, then to anger. That's not what it sounds like, he said quickly, his eyes darting from one face to another. You're twisting this, Eleanor. I looked at him evenly. Am I? Because it sounds like your voice to me. It's out of context, he snapped, his smile gone completely. You're manipulative, you know that? Always trying to make me look bad. Frank shifted slightly in his seat, his calm presence grounding the table. The only one making you look bad right now is yourself, Nathan. Lila's eyes filled with tears. Nathan, you said you'd never speak that way about my mom again. Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his tone changing instantly, becoming soft, pleading. Sweetheart, she's trying to drive a wedge between us. You know how she is. Always overreacting, always looking for drama. That was his game. Deflect, manipulate, confuse. I'd seen it before. But this time, he was performing in front of witnesses, and his act was falling apart. I didn't overreact when you threw a glass at me, Nathan, I said, my tone firm but even. You did that all on your own. The words struck like lightning. The room went deadly still. Lila's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely now. "You told me it was an accident," she whispered. Nathan's jaw clenched. "It was. She startled me." Frank leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You startled easily, huh?" His voice was low, steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd seen too much. Nathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "You people don't know what you're talking about. You're trying to ruin me." "No, Nathan," I said calmly, standing too, meeting his gaze. "You ruined yourself. I just gave you a mirror." He pointed at me, his hand shaking slightly. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can embarrass me in front of everyone?" "I don't need to embarrass you," I said. "You're doing that perfectly well on your own." That was when he lost it. The calm facade, the fake charm, it all cracked open like a shell under pressure. His eyes darkened, his face twisted, and in that moment, the real Nathan emerged. He lunged across the table toward me, his hand reaching for the phone in my hand. The motion was sudden and violent enough that Lila screamed. The glassware rattled. But before he could touch me, a steady voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough," Frank said sharply. The authority in his tone froze Nathan mid-motion. Frank stood, his hand opening his jacket just enough for the glint of his police badge to catch the light. The air in the room shifted. The predator suddenly realized he was surrounded by eyes that saw him clearly. Nathan's face went pale. "You set me up," he whispered, his voice shaking. "No," I replied. "I gave you a chance to show everyone who you really are." He looked around, but there was no sympathy. No support. Even the friends he barely knew had gone silent, disgust written plainly on their faces. Lila sobbed quietly into her napkin. Frank's tone was measured but firm. "I suggest you sit down, Nathan. You've done enough damage for one night." Nathan hesitated, then lowered himself slowly into his chair, his breathing uneven. His hands trembled, his knuckles white. The arrogance that once filled the room had drained away, replaced by a hollow silence. I picked up my glass, my hand steady. "To truth," I said again softly. "Uncomfortable as it may be." No one moved. No one dared to breathe. Lila stood then, her voice shaking but clear. "I'm going home," she said quietly. "Without you." Nathan's head snapped toward her. "Lila, wait." But she didn't. She grabbed her coat and walked out the door. Her steps firm despite the tears streaking down her face. When the door closed, the sound echoed through the room like the final note of a long, tragic song. Nathan sat motionless, eyes darting, the reality of his unraveling sinking in. Frank spoke quietly. "You should go too, Nathan. Before I decide, this dinner needs an official report." Nathan didn't argue. He stood, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out. The front door slammed behind him. The room exhaled collectively. The tension that had hung so thick you could taste it finally began to ease. I sank back into my chair, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind only exhaustion and an odd, quiet relief. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. He had finally shown the world who he really was. And just as he lunged to grab my phone, my brother revealed his badge. Nathan froze mid-motion, his hand suspended halfway across the table, the blood draining from his face. My brother's voice was calm but absolute, the kind of authority that doesn't need to be shouted to be obeyed. "Sit down," Frank said quietly, his hand resting near the edge of his jacket where the badge still glinted. "You're done." For a long second, no one moved. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall filled the silence, steady, deliberate. Then, slowly, Nathan lowered himself back into his seat. His breathing was uneven, his eyes darting between Frank, me, and the guests, who now sat frozen, watching the unraveling of a man who thought he could intimidate everyone around him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You've shown enough of yourself tonight," I said softly, keeping my tone calm. "Everyone here saw it. No more pretending, Nathan." He didn't respond. His jaw tightened, and a vein pulsed at his temple. Lila's absence lingered in the air like a ghost, her empty chair, her unfinished glass of wine, her folded napkin still resting in her lap. Frank broke the silence. "Nathan, you're lucky this is just a dinner. If I'd been off duty and seen what you just did, it would have been a different kind of evening." Nathan scoffed weakly, trying to reclaim some of his arrogance, but it came out hollow. "You think you know me?" he muttered. "You think you can just embarrass me like this in my wife's family home?" I looked him straight in the eye. "Embarrass you? No, Nathan. You did that all by yourself." For a moment, I saw the flicker of rage return, that uncontrollable anger that he'd tried to hide behind politeness. But this time, he knew he couldn't act on it. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and most importantly exposed. Frank leaned forward slightly, his tone even. "You're going to get up, walk out of this house, and not contact my sister or her daughter again. Understood?" Nathan's lip curled. "You can't tell me what to do." "I can if it's about protecting a victim," Frank said firmly. "And after what I saw tonight, that's exactly what this is." I stayed silent, letting Frank take control. There was something profoundly satisfying in watching Nathan shrink beneath my brother's steady gaze. The same man who had once smirked as I bled now sat trembling in his chair, cornered by his own arrogance. When he finally stood, he didn't look at me. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, muttering under his breath, and stalked toward the door. I followed him with my eyes but didn't say a word. He paused just before leaving, his voice low and bitter. "You'll regret this," he said. I tilted my head slightly. "I doubt it." He slammed the door so hard the walls shook. And just like that, the storm passed, leaving only the quiet hum of the house settling after chaos. Frank let out a slow breath and turned to me. "You all right?" I nodded. My hands steady, though my heart was still racing. "I'm fine. Thank you." He studied me for a moment, then gave a small smile. "You handled him better than most would have. You've still got that principal's discipline." I smiled faintly. "It comes in handy." One by one, my guests began to leave, offering awkward but sympathetic goodbyes. No one knew what to say, the shock of what they'd witnessed still clung to the air, but I didn't need their room and tax carry words. Silence spoke enough. When the house was finally empty, except for Frank, I sat down at the dining table and stared at the aftermath. The wine glasses half full, the candle wax pooled on the tablecloth, the remnants of a meal that had turned into a reckoning. Frank sat across from me, his elbows resting on his knees. "What's your next move?" he asked quietly. "I'll talk to Lila tomorrow," I said. "She needs space tonight. But she'll come home when she's ready." He nodded. "And Nathan?" I exhaled slowly. "Nathan's going to learn that control isn't power, and fear doesn't last forever." Frank gave a small nod of approval. "You've got this, Eleanor." After he left, the house grew still again. The kind of stillness that used to feel comforting but now carried weight, a silence filled with the echoes of what had just unfolded. I cleaned the table mechanically, my mind running through every detail of the night. Every glance, every word, every look Nathan had given before he realized his performance was over. I wasn't naive enough to believe it was finished. Men like Nathan don't simply walk away. Their pride doesn't allow it. But I had something now: proof, witnesses, and a brother in law enforcement. And most of all, I had clarity. Later that night, as I washed the last dish, I saw my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same one who had flinched at a flying glass weeks ago. She was steadier, colder, stronger. That was the night I understood something vital. Revenge doesn't always come with noise or chaos. Sometimes, it comes with stillness. With the quiet satisfaction of watching your enemy unravel without ever having to raise your voice. When Lila called just past midnight, her voice was soft and broken. "Mom? I'm here," I said immediately. "I left him," she whispered. "I packed a bag and went to a friend's house. I can't believe what I heard. Tonight, I didn't want to believe he was that man." "I know, sweetheart," I said, my heart aching and swelling at once. "But you're safe now. That's what matters." She started crying softly. What if he comes after me? He won't, I said, my tone firm. Certain. Not this time. He's exposed, and if he tries, he'll regret it. We spoke for a while longer, her voice trembling less with every word. By the time she hung up, she sounded almost free. After the call, I sat in the dark, listening to the house breathe around me. The air felt lighter somehow, though I knew the fight wasn't over yet. There would be consequences, loose ends, perhaps even retaliation. But for now, peace had finally stepped through my door. And in that fragile stillness, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. Nathan would never harm my daughter again. Not with his hands. Not with his words. Not with his power. He had shattered his own illusion tonight, and I would make sure it stayed that way. But I knew that moment was only the beginning of her freedom and his downfall. The following days were a blur of statements, paperwork, and emotions I hadn't felt in years. For so long, my life had been predictable, a steady rhythm of morning tea, phone calls, and the quiet peace of retirement. But now, my world was filled with tension, relief, and the lingering echoes of that dinner. Nathan's mask had finally cracked, and the truth was out for everyone to see. Yet, victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like release, raw, necessary, and heavy. Lila came home 2 days later. She looked tired, her eyes swollen from crying, but there was something new about her too, something fragile yet powerful. She walked into the house slowly, as if unsure she still belonged there. I met her at the doorway and pulled her into my arms without a word. She clung to me, her body trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered against my shoulder. "I should have listened. I thought I could fix him. I really did." I held her tighter. "You don't have to apologize, sweetheart. Love can make us blind, but it doesn't make us weak." She cried quietly for a long time, her tears soaking through my blouse. When she finally pulled back, I could see guilt in her eyes, the kind that lingers long after the bruises fade. "Mom," she said softly, "I kept thinking he'd change. I thought if I just tried harder, he'd stop." I took her hand and guided her to the couch. "You can't change someone who enjoys breaking others, Lila. You can only choose to stop being broken." She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the faint scar still visible on my wrist. "He did this to you," she said, her voice trembling, "and I defended him." "That's what he wanted you to do," I said gently. "Men like Nathan manipulate love until it becomes a weapon. But you took it back the moment you walked out that door." Over the next week, we worked together to untangle her life from his. I helped her contact a lawyer, Janine, of course, and begin the process of filing charges. Frank coordinated the legal side quietly, making sure everything was handled carefully, professionally. There was no yelling, no confrontation this time, just methodical, silent action. Nathan tried to call her 3 times. She didn't answer. Then came the texts, apologies, excuses, and eventually threats wrapped in fake remorse. We documented everything. Every word was evidence. Every message showed another piece of his unraveling mind. Janine handled the paperwork for a restraining order, and within days, it was official. Nathan was legally forbidden from coming near Lila or contacting her in any way. When she held that document in her hands, I saw the faintest spark of peace return to her eyes. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was the first step. Words spread quietly through our small circle of family and friends. People who once praised Nathan for his charm now avoided saying his name. Some of them were shocked, others weren't. That's the thing about abusers, they often wear their masks so well that people see what they want to see. But those of us who've stood too close can always tell when the cracks start to show. One morning, about a week after everything, I found Lila sitting in the garden, staring at the roses. She used to love tending them before she married Nathan. The sight made me smile. "I forgot how much I missed this," she said softly, touching a bloom. "You're remembering who you are," I told her. "That's the beauty of healing, it brings you back to yourself." She smiled faintly. "Do you think he'll leave us alone now?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "For now, yes. But men like Nathan don't give up easily. That's why we don't stop protecting ourselves. She nodded, understanding. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, only awareness. That was enough for me. The days that followed were filled with small acts of normalcy, cooking together, watching old movies, walking through the park. Each moment was a quiet victory. Every laugh she let escape, every night she slept peacefully without jumping at the sound of her phone, it all mattered. I realized something during those days. Revenge, as satisfying as it sounded, wasn't truly what I wanted. What I wanted was liberation for her, for me, for anyone who had ever been made to feel powerless. I didn't need Nathan to suffer publicly or to see his life collapse. His punishment was already happening. He'd lost control, his greatest addiction. Still, I couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. Late one night, as I sat in my living room reading, headlights flashed across the window. For a second, my heart stopped. But it was just a passing car. The fear was irrational, but instinct has a way of whispering when logic tries to sleep. The next morning, Frank stopped by. He'd heard that Nathan was being investigated for harassment at work after a coworker filed a complaint. "Looks like his temper isn't limited to family dinners," he said grimly. I wasn't surprised. Men like Nathan don't implode quietly. They take everyone down with them until someone stops them. This time, that someone wasn't just me, it was a trail of people who had finally seen through him. By the end of that month, the restraining order was in full effect, and the case against him was building. Lila found a therapist and began attending a support group for survivors. Each session made her lighter, stronger. One evening, as we sat by the fire, she turned to me. "You know, Mom," she said softly, "you didn't just save me. You saved the version of me I was losing." Her words hit deep. I didn't reply right away, just took her hand and squeezed it. Maybe revenge had never been about retaliation. Maybe it had always been about restoration, about helping someone reclaim their power when someone else tried to steal it. As I looked at her, the woman who had once been scared and silent, I saw strength where there had once been fear. Nathan's downfall wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, methodical, and unstoppable because this time, the women he underestimated refused to stay silent. And that, I thought, was the kind of revenge that truly lasts. Yet, deep down, I sensed Nathan wasn't done trying to reclaim control. One quiet afternoon, a familiar car parked at the end of my driveway. The sound of its engine made my stomach twist before my mind even caught up. I knew that sound too well, the low hum, the way it idled as if waiting for permission to approach. When I parted the curtain and looked outside, my breath caught in my throat. Nathan. He stood beside his car, staring at the house. He looked different, disheveled, tired, his face unshaven. But the arrogance was still there, flickering behind his eyes like a dying flame that refused to go out. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near us. The restraining order was clear, but men like Nathan didn't care about rules, they cared about control. I reached for my phone and called Frank immediately. "He's here," I whispered, my voice low but steady. Frank didn't hesitate. "Don't go outside. Lock the doors. I'm on my way." I hung up and moved through the house calmly, checking each lock, each window. My heart was racing, but my hands didn't tremble. I'd faced this man's wrath before, and I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear. Lila was upstairs taking a nap. She'd been sleeping better lately, finally allowing herself to rest. I didn't want her to wake to this. I wanted her peace to last as long as possible. Nathan began shouting from the driveway. His voice was hoarse but loud enough to carry. "Eleanor, I know you're in there." I didn't respond. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "You think you can take everything from me? My wife, my home, my reputation?" I stayed by the front window, hidden behind the curtain, watching. He wasn't wearing a suit today. His shirt was wrinkled, his shoes scuffed. His control was slipping away with every frantic step he took. "You don't get to destroy me," he yelled, his voice cracking. "You don't get to win." The neighbors began peeking through their windows. Mrs. Carter across the street came onto her porch, her phone in hand, probably calling the police. For once, I didn't care who saw. I wanted people to see. I wanted his mask completely stripped away. Lila stirred upstairs. I could hear her footsteps, soft and uncertain. "Mom?" she called, her voice groggy. I turned just as she reached the bottom of the stairs. When she saw my expression, her face went pale. "He's here, isn't he?" "Yes," I said calmly. "But the police and your uncle are on their way. Stay inside, don't open the door." She nodded, her eyes wide, and moved to stand beside me. We watched together as Nathan continued pacing, shouting, unraveling. His words tumbled out faster now, less coherent. "You turned her against me. You made her hate me. You lied about everything." I felt Lila trembling beside me, so I reached out and took her hand. "He's desperate," I whispered. "Desperation is what comes before defeat." Nathan suddenly turned toward the house again. "Come out here, Eleanor," he shouted. "You're going to fix this. You're going to tell everyone the truth." That word, truth, it almost made me laugh. The irony of him demanding it, after spending years distorting it. I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders. "Stay here," I told Lila. "Lock the door behind me." Her grip tightened on my hand. "Mom, no. Don't go out there." I looked at her, calm and certain. "He's not in control anymore, sweetheart. I am." Before she could stop me, I stepped outside. The autumn air was cool against my skin. Nathan turned at the sound of the door opening, surprise flickering across his face. He hadn't expected me to face him head-on. "Eleanor," he said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "You don't have to do this. You can fix it. You can talk to Lila, tell her you overreacted." I stood at the edge of the porch, my arms folded. "Overreacted?" I repeated, my voice calm but sharp. "You violated a court order, Nathan. You're standing on my property, screaming like a madman. And you think I'm the one overreacting?" He clenched his fists. "You don't understand what you've done. You ruined everything I worked for." "No, Nathan," I said softly. "You ruined it yourself. You destroyed your own life the moment you thought control was the same thing as love." For a second, the fury drained from his face, replaced by something hollow, fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that there was no one left to believe his lies. Blue and red lights flashed down the street just then. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder until they stopped at the curb. 2 police cars pulled up, and Frank's familiar voice called out, "Eleanor, step back." Nathan spun around as the officers approached, shouting, "She's lying. This is all her fault." One officer moved forward, firm and professional. "Mr. Clark, you're in violation of a restraining order. Step away from the vehicle and put your hands where I can see them." Nathan hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. Then, with one final burst of rage, he shouted, "You can't control me!" But it was over. The officers moved in, handcuffed him, and led him toward the car. Nathan struggled at first, yelling, cursing, but the fight had gone out of him. His voice cracked under the weight of his own undoing. Lila stepped outside just as they placed him in the back seat. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. She watched in silence as the car door closed, as the man who once controlled her life was driven away under flashing lights. Frank walked up to us, resting a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "He won't be back, Eleanor," he said quietly. "Not after this." I nodded, exhaling slowly. The tension that had lived inside me for months began to unwind, thread by thread. Lila turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you stay so calm?" "Because," I said, watching the police car disappear down the street, "men like Nathan feed on fear. The moment you stop being afraid, they lose everything." We stood there for a long while, the cool breeze brushing against our faces. The street grew quiet again, peaceful. And as I looked at my daughter free, safe, finally unbroken, I realized something I hadn't before. Revenge didn't always mean striking back. Sometimes, it meant standing still while the storm destroyed itself. Watching him being handcuffed, I realized true power wasn't in retaliation, it was in composure. Peace doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in fragments, quiet mornings, slower breaths. Moments when you realize you haven't flinched at the sound of a car door in days. After Nathan's arrest, that's what our lives became. Fragments slowly fitting back together, forming something that resembled peace, even if it wasn't whole yet. Lila stayed with me, at least for the time being. The first few nights were hard. She'd wake from nightmares, her voice caught in her throat, the remnants of his anger still echoing in her mind. I'd sit beside her, holding her hand until she drifted back to sleep. Healing, I knew, wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning how to live without fear being the loudest voice in the room. The house felt different now, lighter, as though it could finally breathe again after months of holding its breath. I began rearranging small things, the photos on the walls, the vase on the table, the curtains in the living room. It wasn't just redecorating, it was reclaiming. The dining table where Nathan had once raised his voice was now where we sat in laughter, where Lila and I shared coffee and talked about the future. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, Lila turned to me. "Mom," she said softly, "does it ever stop hurting?" I looked at her. Really looked at her. The bruises were gone, but the emotional ones still lingered, faint shadows in her eyes. "It doesn't stop," I told her honestly. "But it fades. And one day, you'll realize the pain stopped controlling you." She nodded slowly, as if trying to let the truth of that settle. I saw her grow stronger every day. She began cooking again, tending to the garden, calling her friends the ones she'd lost touch with because Nathan didn't approve of them. One by one, they came back into her life, voices of support that replaced his manipulation. She laughed more, smiled longer, and when she spoke, there was conviction in her voice again. Frank came by often, checking in quietly. He never asked about Nathan unless we brought him up. He'd simply sit on the porch, sipping coffee, and let us talk about anything but the past. Sometimes, that silence was the best therapy. Nathan's case moved quickly. The evidence, my recordings, the witnesses, his violation of the restraining order left little room for denial. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by mandatory counseling. The prosecutor told us he'd shown no remorse, no acknowledgement of guilt. That didn't surprise me. When the day came to attend the hearing, Lila hesitated. "I don't know if I can face him," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to," I replied. "But if you want to, remember you're not the woman he once controlled. You're the one who walked away." She looked at me, her eyes steady. "Then I'll go." The courtroom was cold and sterile, the kind of place that strips emotion from everything. When they brought Nathan in, his arrogance was gone. The expensive suit was replaced by a plain orange jumpsuit, his hair unkempt, his posture slouched. For the first time, he looked small, powerless. Lila didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply watched, her silence louder than any words could have been. When the judge handed down the sentence, Nathan barely reacted. But when the gavel struck, something shifted in Lila. Her shoulders straightened, her breath steadied. I saw peace begin to take root inside her. That night, we returned home in silence. The stars were out, glittering above the dark sky like tiny promises. Lila sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames. "I don't feel angry," she said finally. "I thought I would, but I don't. I just feel done." "That's not weakness," I told her. "That's strength. Anger burns fast. Peace lasts longer." She smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Always know what to say." "I've had practice," I said softly. We began rebuilding not just our routines but our sense of self. Lila started attending therapy sessions regularly, and over time, she found her voice again. She joined a local women's support group, and after a few weeks, she began helping others tell their stories. Watching her transform from victim to advocate filled me with pride I can't describe. As for me, I returned to volunteering. The local shelter had grown since I last worked there, filled with women and children escaping lives that looked eerily familiar. When I spoke to them, I no longer sounded like someone teaching lessons. I spoke as someone who understood the quiet rage and steady patience of survival. We replaced the old dining table with a new one, solid oak, polished and strong. It felt symbolic, like we were rewriting history. The old one had splinters of the past embedded in its wood. This one carried no ghosts. And every time I caught my reflection in its surface, I saw a woman who had been tested but not broken. The scar on my wrist faded with time, but I never tried to hide it. It wasn't a flaw, it was a reminder, a mark of everything I'd endured and everything I'd reclaimed. One afternoon, a few months later, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name written in neat, familiar handwriting. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. But I did. Inside was a single page, a letter from Nathan. The handwriting was shaky, the words rambling, alternating between apology and blame. He claimed he'd found clarity and hoped I could forgive him, for both our peace. I read it once, slowly. Then, without hesitation, I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Not out of sentimentality, but as a record, a reminder of what I'd survived. Lila saw it later and frowned. "You kept it?" "Only as proof," I said. "Not of what he wrote, but of what we overcame." She smiled. "You're stronger than I ever realized, Mom." I looked at her. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the same about her. "So are you." The night ended quietly, the house glowing softly under the lamplight. For the first time in years, it felt like home again, untouched by fear, untouched by control. Just peace. And just when I thought it was over, a letter arrived in my mailbox with his handwriting on it. I hesitated before opening the envelope, even though I already knew what it was. My name, Eleanor Grace, was written in that careful, deliberate handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards, notes to Lila, and once, on a cruelly worded apology after that first accident. Seeing it again sent a chill through me, not of fear this time, but of something colder finality. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where so much of this story had begun, and stared at the letter for several minutes before I finally unfolded it. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, though not from nerves. It was anger, old, quiet anger that had settled deep in my bones. "Eleanor," the letter began, "I've had a lot of time to think. That opening line alone told me everything. People like Nathan never think. They calculate, they rationalize, they reframe. They never see their own cruelty as cruelty, only as mistakes that others made them commit. I know I made mistakes," it continued. "I said things I didn't mean. But you have to understand what it's like to lose everything. I loved Lila, even if I didn't always show it right. You turned her against me. You made her believe I was a monster. Maybe I was, but you didn't give me a chance to prove I could change." I paused, reading that line twice. Maybe I was. It was the closest thing to accountability he'd ever offered, and even then, it was followed by justification. Every sentence was a plea wrapped in manipulation, a reminder of how skillfully he twisted guilt into a tool. He went on, "They make us sit through these sessions, hear group therapy, accountability circles. I'm learning, Eleanor. I really am. I see now that I was too proud, too angry. I didn't know how to handle someone as strong as Lila or you. You pushed back, and I pushed harder. I'm sorry for that. I know it's too late, but I wanted to apologize." A real apology would have stopped there. But Nathan wasn't capable of ending things cleanly. He always needed the last word. "I'll be released soon. Don't worry, I'm not coming for revenge. I just hope someday you'll tell Lila to talk to me again. I want peace." I think, deep down, she might too. That was the last line before his signature, neat, deliberate, as though he wanted to appear reformed even in ink. I read the letter twice, then set it down slowly. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. There was no fear left in me, only clarity. For years, Nathan had thrived on reaction, anger, fear, guilt. That's how he kept control. But this letter, like everything else, was powerless now. It was nothing but words from a man whose voice no longer mattered. When Lila came home later that evening, she noticed the opened envelope on the table. "What's that?" she asked, drying her hands on a towel. I looked at her, calm. A ghost, I said simply. She frowned slightly and picked up the page. Her eyes scanned it quickly, then narrowed. He actually wrote to you? Apparently, prison gives people plenty of time to find pens, I replied. She finished reading, her expression shifting between anger and disbelief. He still doesn't get it. He's not sorry. He's just empty. I nodded. That's exactly right. Do you want me to burn it? She asked. I smiled faintly. No, let it stay. Not as a reminder of him, but as proof that he no longer has power. She thought about that for a moment, then folded the letter neatly and slid it back into the envelope. You always know how to take back the narrative, don't you? Someone has to, I said quietly. That night, I sat by the fireplace again. The flames danced, soft and gold, casting light over the walls that had once witnessed so much tension. I thought about forgiveness, what it really meant. People talk about forgiveness as though it's some noble act of grace. But to me, forgiveness had nothing to do with him. It wasn't about letting Nathan off the hook or believing in his transformation. Forgiveness, I realized, was a way of cutting the last thread that tied me to him. It wasn't a gift for him, it was a release for me. So I forgave him not for what he did, but for what I refused to let it keep doing to me. I whispered it out loud, not for him to hear, but for the walls that had once trembled from his presence. I forgive you, Nathan. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. And in that moment, the tension that had lived in my chest for so long finally began to dissolve. A week later, I received confirmation that Nathan's letter had been forwarded to his parole officer and logged as contact, meaning he wouldn't be able to send another. Frank had arranged it quietly. Just in case, he said when I thanked him. I didn't tell Lila right away. She was beginning to live again, really live. She'd started a new job, met new friends, and even adopted a golden retriever puppy she named Daisy. I didn't want to taint her newfound peace with more reminders of him. But one evening, as we sat together watching Daisy chase her tail in the living room, Lila turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't said anything that night?" I looked at her, thinking carefully. Sometimes, I admitted. But then I remember that silence is what people like Nathan count on. If I'd stayed quiet, he'd still have you. That thought alone makes every scar worth it. She nodded, her eyes glistening. You were my strength when I had none. I reached over and took her hand. And now, you're your own. The letter still sat in the drawer upstairs, tucked neatly between pages of old documents. I didn't need to destroy it. It had no power anymore. It was just paper ink on a page written by a man who no longer mattered. When I went to bed that night, I felt a peace that was unfamiliar but welcome. The kind that doesn't come from revenge or justice, but from knowing the story is finally over. At least, that's what I believed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that his shadow might linger longer than we expected. Months passed, and life began to bloom again in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. The air in the house felt lighter. The silence that once suffocated us had transformed into something peaceful, comfortable even. The past still existed, of course, but it no longer held dominion over every moment. It lingered like an old scar, visible, but healed. Lila was changing right before my eyes. Each day she seemed to stand a little taller, laugh a little louder. She'd started a new job at a community center, working with women who were rebuilding their lives. When she told me about it, her voice was soft but filled with conviction. I want to help people the way you helped me, she said. I want them to know they're not alone. And she was good at it. Her compassion, once used against her, had become her strength. I'd watch her come home from work, tired but fulfilled, a spark of purpose lighting her eyes again. She'd talk about the people she met, the stories they shared, some heartbreaking, some full of hope. In her healing, she was helping others find their own. One sunny afternoon, she came home with something unexpected. A puppy. A golden retriever with floppy ears and 2 big paws. She named her Daisy. The dog brought laughter back into the house, chasing shadows out of corners that had been heavy for too long. Daisy doesn't know pain, Lila said one evening as we watched the puppy chew a slipper. She just exists, happy, trusting, alive. I want to live like that. I smiled. Then do. And she did. Slowly, beautifully, she began reclaiming her life. As for me, I found myself drawn back into the world I'd once stepped away from, the world of advocacy, of listening, of standing quietly beside those who had lost their voices. The local women's shelter reached out, asking if I'd consider volunteering again. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to open old wounds. But then I thought about the women who had no one, who sat in silence, believing the pain was their fault, and I knew what I had to do. The first time I stood in front of a small group of survivors, I felt a familiar tremor of emotion. Not fear, but the weight of responsibility. I introduced myself not as a retired principal, but simply as Eleanor, a woman who had seen darkness and found her way back to the light. I'm not here to talk about forgiveness, I told them. I'm here to talk about freedom. The kind that comes when you stop defining yourself by what was done to you and start remembering who you were before it happened. The room was silent, but the women listened. Some nodded, others wiped quiet tears. I realized then that my story, painful as it was, had purpose. My voice wasn't just mine anymore, it belonged to everyone who'd ever been silenced. A few weeks later, the shelter invited me to speak at their annual gala, a fundraiser for survivors and outreach programs. I almost said no. Public speaking hadn't been on my mind for years. But Lila encouraged me. You've always been the strongest voice in the room, Mom, she said. It's time people hear it again. The night of the event, I wore a deep navy dress and pinned my hair up. When I looked in the mirror before leaving, I hardly recognized the woman staring back. She looked older, yes, but also wiser, like someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Not unscathed, but unbroken. When I stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the room. The lights were warm, soft, almost comforting. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told them my story, not every detail, but enough to paint a picture of survival, resilience, and dignity. I spoke about my daughter, about fear turned to strength, about revenge that transformed into something more meaningful, reclamation. I used to think revenge was about making someone pay, I said to the audience, but I've learned it's about something quieter, something stronger. It's about refusing to let pain define you. It's about standing tall in the ruins and saying, I'm still here. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment, and then applause erupted, loud, sustained, heartfelt. I saw tears in people's eyes, smiles of recognition, hope rekindled. That night, for the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted by my past. I felt empowered by it. After the speech, people came up to thank me, to share their own experiences. Each one reminded me why I had come back, to remind others that survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning. As the evening wound down, I stepped off the stage and stood at the edge of the room, watching people laugh, dance, and talk. Lila joined me, her arm linking through mine. I'm proud of you, she whispered. I'm proud of us, I said. We stood together, watching the lights twinkle across the room like stars. The past was still part of us, but it no longer held us prisoner. It was simply the path that had led us here, to freedom, to purpose, to peace. Then, just as I was about to suggest we leave, my gaze drifted to the far corner of the room. Among the crowd, seated at the back near the exit, was a face I never expected to see again. The light caught his features just enough for recognition to settle like ice in my veins. Nathan's sister Clara. Her expression was somber. Her eyes fixed on me with a mix of sorrow and something deeper. She stood slowly, hesitant, as if deciding whether to approach. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from curiosity. What did she want? Why now? And as I looked out into the crowd, I saw a familiar face, someone I never expected. It took me a few seconds to place her. But once I did, the air seemed to thin around me. Clara, Nathan's sister, the same woman who hadn't spoken to me once throughout his trial, who'd kept her distance as if guilt could be hidden behind silence. And now, here she was, standing at the back of the gala where I'd just finished speaking about survival, dignity, and reclaiming power. For a moment, I didn't move. The applause still echoed faintly through the hall, the chatter of guests rising like soft static. But my focus was fixed on her. Clara was holding something, a small clutch pressed tightly against her chest, her knuckles pale. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, but filled with a sincerity I hadn't expected. When she finally stepped forward, she moved slowly, as though walking on thin ice. The crowd between us seemed to part on its own, the noise around us fading until it felt like the room held only the two of us. "Eleanor," she said softly when she reached me. "I hope this isn't a bad time." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with emotion. I straightened, my posture calm though my pulse quickened. "Clara," I said evenly. "It's been a while." She nodded. "Yes. Too long." Up close, she looked older than I remembered. There were faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the kind that come from years of carrying burdens you didn't deserve. Her resemblance to Nathan was subtle, the same dark eyes, the same angular features, but hers held none of his arrogance. Instead, there was sadness. A kind of quiet regret that seemed to have settled into her bones. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," she said quickly, as if reading my thoughts. "I just wanted to listen to you speak. I wasn't sure if I should, but I had to." I studied her for a moment, then gestured toward a quieter corner of the hall. "Let's talk." We walked to the side, away from the music and laughter. Lila noticed us from across the room, but when she saw who it was, she didn't intervene. She trusted me to handle it, and I was grateful for that. Clara took a shaky breath once we were alone. "I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry," she said. "For everything. For what my brother did to you. To Lila. I've carried that guilt for so long." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "I knew what he was capable of, Eleanor. I saw it when we were kids. Our father was just like him, loud, cruel, unpredictable. Nathan learned early that control meant power. I tried to stop him once, years ago, when we were still young. But he was already too far gone." The admission hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd thought of Nathan as a monster born of choice. Hearing he was molded by something darker didn't excuse him, but it explained the roots of his cruelty. "I didn't know," I said quietly. Clara nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No one did. I thought maybe if I ignored it, if I distanced myself, it wouldn't define me too. But then Lila happened. And you. And I saw the same story replaying itself all over again, and I did nothing. I was a coward. Her honesty disarmed me. I'd expected defensiveness, denial, something that resembled her brother. But instead, I saw a woman who'd spent her life haunted by the same shadow that had hurt us. "You can't take responsibility for his choices," I said gently. "You didn't create him." She shook her head. "Maybe not. But I didn't stop him either. I could have warned her. I could have told you what he was. Like before it got that far." "Would I have believed you?" I asked softly. Lila was in love. I wanted to believe she was happy. We all saw what we wanted to see. She wiped her eyes, nodding. "You're right. Denial's easier than confrontation. I know that better than anyone." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The music in the background shifted to something slower, softer. Around us, people laughed, glasses clinked, and yet, our small corner of the room felt suspended in time, two women bound by a shared wound neither of us had chosen. "I visited him once," Clara said finally, her voice quiet. "In prison." I tensed slightly but didn't interrupt. "He's different," she continued. "Or at least he wants to be. He told me he's been trying to change, that he prays, writes letters, reads about anger and empathy. I don't know if it's real. Part of me wants to believe it is, but another part of me knows that change that deep doesn't happen just because someone's caged." Her gaze lifted to meet mine. "He asked me to tell you he's sorry. That's not why I came here, though. I came to tell you that he's sick. The doctors think it's serious. Liver disease. He doesn't have much time." The words landed heavily between us. I didn't feel joy, or pity, or even vindication. Just stillness. After everything he'd done, after the chaos and fear, this was how it ended? Not in drama, not in confrontation, but in decay. I see, I said quietly. Clara nodded. He doesn't want to see Lila. He knows she wouldn't come. But he asked if you'd read his last letter when it comes. He said it's not about excuses this time. I let out a slow breath, my eyes drifting toward the stage where the lights still shimmered faintly. I'll read it, I said finally. Not for him, but for closure. Clara exhaled shakily, as though she'd been holding that breath for years. Thank you, she whispered. When she turned to leave, I reached out and touched her arm gently. Clara, I said, you did the right thing tonight. You faced it. That's more courage than your brother ever had. She gave a small, tearful smile. Maybe now we can all stop living in his shadow. As she walked away, disappearing into the crowd, I felt an unexpected sense of peace wash over me. For years I'd defined my strength by what I stood against Nathan, his cruelty, his control. But now I realized strength could also be quiet, compassionate, forgiving without forgetting. I looked across the room and saw Lila laughing with some of the women from her shelter. She was radiant, alive, and free. That was the real ending, not revenge, not punishment, but renewal. And as I turned back toward the soft glow of the stage lights, I thought of that shattered glass so long ago, how something broken could still reflect light. I thought of that shattered glass and smiled. It had once cut me, but now, it reflected my strength. Today, when I look back on everything that happened, I don't feel rage or bitterness. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for surviving, for healing, for finding strength in places I didn't know it existed. There was a time when I believed power came from control, from striking back, from having the last word. But now, I understand something simpler. Real power lives in dignity. It lives in silence that chooses peace over vengeance. It's been almost 3 years since that night Nathan smashed the glass. The scar on my wrist has faded, a pale silver line that only I notice anymore. Sometimes, when sunlight hits it just right, it gleams faintly, a reminder of how pain can turn into resilience if you let it. Lila's life looks completely different now. She remarried last spring to a man named Thomas, a gentle soul who treats her with the kindness she always deserved. Their wedding was small, just family, close friends, and laughter that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. I remember watching her walk down the aisle, her face radiant, her steps sure. For a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who believed the world was good and safe. And I realized she'd finally found her way back to that feeling. Thomas loves her softly, with patience and respect. Sometimes, when I visit them, I catch him watching her with quiet admiration, as if he still can't believe she's real. And every time he reaches for her hand, I feel a quiet peace, knowing she's finally home in someone's heart, not trapped in someone's shadow. As for me, my days are full but peaceful. I still volunteer at the women's shelter. I lead small workshops where I tell my story not as a tragedy, but as a lesson. I tell the women who come through those doors that survival isn't just about escaping someone who hurts you. It's about rediscovering the self you lost along the way. Pain doesn't define you. It refines you. It shapes you into someone who knows her worth so deeply, she'll never let anyone take it again. They listen, sometimes nodding, sometimes crying. And afterward, when they thank me, I always say the same thing. You'll thank yourself one day. I keep in touch with Clara occasionally. After that night at the gala, she wrote to me a few times. Nathan passed away quietly about a year after our conversation, liver failure, as the doctors had predicted. She said he'd spent his final weeks writing letters, though she burned most of them, saying some stories don't need to be retold. I agreed. Closure doesn't always require answers, it just needs an ending. When I heard of his death, I didn't feel relief or sorrow. I felt balance. The world had a way of settling its own accounts. I whispered a quiet prayer. Not for him, but for every woman who'd ever been caught in a storm like his. And then, I let it go. Completely. The following spring, Lila and I planted new roses in the garden, the same spot where the old ones had wilted the year she left Nathan. As we dug into the earth, side by side, the air smelled of renewal. Daisy, her golden retriever, darted around us, chasing butterflies. "These will bloom by summer," Lila said, patting the soil. "They'll bloom strong," I replied, smiling. "They always do after surviving the frost. That garden has become our ritual, our way of honoring growth. Every year we add something new. This year, we planted lavender for calm, daisies for hope, and a single oak sapling in the corner for endurance. Watching it grow reminds me of us rooted deeply, reaching upward no matter what storms come. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I sit outside with a cup of tea and listen to the world, the wind through the trees, the distant hum of life moving forward. I think about everything we went through, the pain and the lessons, and I realize that my story isn't just about what was done to me, it's about what I did with it. Because revenge doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes, it's choosing to live so fully, so fearlessly, that the person who tried to break you becomes irrelevant. Sometimes, it's smiling again, loving again, thriving in the very peace they tried to destroy. I've come to understand that dignity is the quietest form of revenge there is. It doesn't demand an audience. It doesn't scream for validation. It just exists steady, unbothered, unbreakable. One evening after dinner at Lila's house, Thomas asked me, "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" I thought about that for a moment before answering. "No," I said softly. "Because if they had, we might not be who we are now. Sometimes life has to break you open to show you what you're made of." He smiled thoughtfully, then raised his glass. "To strength," he said. I lifted mine too. "To dignity." Lila watched us both, her eyes shining with quiet joy. In that moment, I realized something profound. Our story wasn't one of destruction. It was one of rebirth. We hadn't just survived Nathan. We had transcended him. When I left their house that night, the sky was painted in hues of gold and violet. The sun dipped low, casting long, warm shadows over the earth. I paused at the end of the driveway, breathing in the crisp evening air, and looked back. Through the window, I saw Lila and Thomas laughing together. Daisy curled at their feet. And I smiled. The light spilling from that home wasn't just from lamps or candles. It was from the people inside, from the peace that had finally taken root after years of chaos. As I walked home beneath the setting sun, I felt that same light inside me, gentle, steady, eternal. My life wasn't defined by the glass that shattered or the pain that followed. It was defined by what came after the rebuilding. The grace. The choice to rise without hatred. In the end, revenge didn't give me power. Dignity did. And that, I realized, was the truest kind of victory. And that, more than revenge, became my greatest victory.